meet us.
Good morning everyone. Today I want to talk about one of the most easily misunderstood and difficult to define terms in fighting games, because I want to talk about mix-ups. One of the most common questions I get on the channel is, what is a mix-up? How do I apply one? How do I defend against one? What does somebody mean when they refer to a true 50-50? And does that mean that there is such a thing as a non-true 50-50? Well, I want to attempt to answer all of those questions in this video, but I also want to take it one step further and carry that into a discussion of the mechanics of Tekken and why some characters are better than others. So even though it might sound like a video that is more geared towards newer players, there hopefully will be some interesting discussion in here, even for people who have a lot of experience with the game. So the first thing I want to do, because you know I'm all about trying to tie things down with terminology, is I want to come up with my own textbook definition of what a mix-up is in Tekken. And it's surprisingly difficult to do, because you sort of have to come up with something that is broad enough that it encompasses everything that could be a mix-up. But what I came up with is something like this. A mix-up in Tekken is when the player with the advantage or momentum has at least two offensive options, attempting to deal defensively with one of which will leave the defender susceptible to at least one of the others. Now I know that that sounds very broad, and I didn't even mention lows or mids, but there's a reason for that, and it will sort of become clear as we go through the video. But at the start of that definition, I talked about the player with the advantage or the momentum. And so it has to be your turn to attack when you want to apply a mix-up. And so there are a couple of different ways it can become your turn. It needs to be clear to both players who is going to attack next, who is applying the mix-up and who is eating the mix-up. And most common three ways that happens is, well, first of all, you can get plus frames on hit. So if I connect with a move that gives me a lot of frame advantage on hit, for example this back 3 on hit, that means that Katarina is now at such a disadvantage that she simply has to wait and try and predict what I am going to do next. The other way you can do it is, of course, plus frames on block, and this is another good move, or a good move that illustrates that situation as well, because Miguel will get big plus frames for having this back 3 blocked as well. So on block or hit, Miguel has enough advantage that he's able to apply a mix-up. He's also able to apply a mix-up out of a mix-up stance because it has access to Savage, but we're going to talk about that more later. The other or final of these three situations that I wanted to bring up is that the Oki situation is a very sort of clear situation when you're able to apply a mix-up. So if I spike my opponent like that at the end of a combo, I'm standing up, I have access to my entire move list and a lot of different options, and my opponent simply wants to try and get off the ground and survive. And so I can use that to create a mix-up where certain actions my opponent can take will be dealt with in very potent ways by me, and so they sort of have to guess and sort of get out of that sticky situation. So those are the three most common situations where a typical mix-up will be applied. And in all of these situations, the most common mix-up you're going to see is a low being mixed with a mid. And it's sort of obvious why when you think about it, because in Tekken, when you're stand blocking, lows will always connect. You can't block them when you're standing up. You have to crouch block them, but if you crouch block, mids will always connect and cannot be blocked. So that is the most common shape that a mix-up can take. But a mix-up does not have to be a mid and a low. It can actually take a lot of different sort of weird shapes, and we're going to talk about a couple of them later. But before we move on, I sort of briefly want to talk about the concept of the mix-up stance. I mentioned Savage here briefly. Savage is a functional mix-up stance, and this is something that I've talked about a lot in other videos, but I'm very interested in the way that Namco creates their stances and for what purposes the stances exist, because I look at the different complementary sort of properties of the move that come out of the stance, and I try and understand, is there really a powerful mix-up in here? Or is this stance for some other purpose? You know, some stances in the game aren't really good at mixing up. They're mainly used for like combos. But Savage is a good example of a stance that is powerful specifically for mix-ups. You will typically enter it off of another move, such as this back 3, or maybe a down forward one. And when you get advantage either on block or on hit when you're going into this stance, you do have both an unseeable potent low, mainly in the shape of the down back 3 here, but you also have stuff like the down 4-3. And you also have a couple of powerful mids. and this up forward 3 happens to be the best and most common one because it is safe, and having a safe mid for your mix-up is one of the most powerful things I think you can have as a character. That's another thing that we're going to come back to. So Savage stance is a true mix-up stance, and if you're able to access it with Miguel with advantage when you're going at your opponent, you will be able to mix up the opponent. It's also a very diverse stance. You can actually go into this stance, have disadvantage, and then do stuff like armor through a move or attempt to crush a move, and still do powerful, potent stuff with it. So it's an extremely diverse and very large stance, but it does have true mix-up potential at its core. Now the next thing I want to talk about is an example of a mix-up stance that doesn't really function and doesn't do its job, because we have Katarina on the screen here. Oh, this is completely the wrong menu. Here we go. We have Katarina on the screen, and she has a stance known as Harrier, which looks like this, right? You've seen it before. And the thing about Harrier is that it might look like a mix-up stance on the surface, but if you're playing against opponent who knows how to deal with it, it doesn't actually have true mix-up potential, because okay, if we're going to consider the low you have, the only low you have from this stance, it's this 3, and this 3 is reactable, and a low that comes in a mix-up needs to be non-reactable. It has to be an unseeable low, because for the mix-up to actually work, the opponent has to be forced to guess, and they don't have to guess whether or not this low is going to come out, because they can wait and look for it, and if they see it, they're going to be able to duck and launch it on reaction. And so while this doesn't really function as a mix-up, it will become a true mix-up if you are playing against an opponent who doesn't have the reaction time to see this low in time. And so it's really weird how sometimes whether or not something is a real mix-up is going to depend on the reaction speed of your opponent. They could also be distracted, which means that one time when you apply this low as part of your mix-up, your opponent isn't able to react to it and the mix-up works, but the next time they're more focused and more prepared, and that time they do have the ability to react, and so that mix-up didn't work. However, that time maybe you did a mid instead, so even though they could have potentially have dealt with that mix-up, you didn't apply it in the way that would have worked. So you can see how it's kind of like an ethereal and weird subject. But you have this mid with Katarina, you have a couple of different mids, you have this low, and then the other option that you can use to incentivize your opponent to duck so that you're able to apply a mix-up is this Harrier 1+2, or sorry, down forward 1+2, which will go into her 1+2 break command grab right here. And so because this is a powerful throw, it's another thing that you might want to duck, because if you duck it, not only do you avoid it, you get the opportunity to launch punish it from while standing, right? Well, problem being, like I said, the low is reactable, and so it doesn't really work for mix-ups, and then the throw obviously also reactable, and because she only has one throw here, the opponent, if they are reacting to it properly, will always break 1+2. There's only one way to break that throw, and so if you wanted this to be a mix-up stance that works, you would either have to give Katarina an unreactable low that the opponent might want to duck, or the other thing you could do is that you could give her one more throw that has to be broken in a different way, and that might allow her for a throw mix-up, which is another type of mix-up that exists in the game. So that's going to tie up my little discussion on mix-up stances, and so it's something that I consider a lot when I think about characters and their stances. And I talked a lot about Negan around the time he came out, because I thought his intimidation stance was basically crap, because they hadn't considered these complementary properties of the different moves in his stance in a constructive enough way that he can get mix-ups out of his stance. But actually, I was laying in bed last night and thinking a little bit about Negan's stance, and it actually occurred to me that it is a proper mix-up stance in a weird way. So we're gonna cut the video here one time and move on to a different stage and talk a little bit about that. Okay, so we've moved on to the jungle, and now I want to use these two characters to illustrate one of the weird shapes that a mix-up can take. I was thinking a lot about Negan, like I said the other day, and how I think it's weird that the developers did such a great job with his move list. I honestly think he has the most well-constructed move list of any of the guest characters, and then they gave him a mix-up stance that simply doesn't seem to work, and a lot of people were down on Negan when he came out, me included, because he has this sort of weird stance. And The reason people didn't think it works for mix-ups is that they wanted to get creative with the way Intimidation stance incentivizes the opponent to duck. So they didn't give him a low out of the stance, but they gave him a throw instead. And this throw is unbreakable, meaning that if it connects, you're always going to eat the damage. And so the only way of dealing with it is to duck it, which in theory allows it to function the same as a low for sort of mix-up purposes. Problem being that they made the throw so slow to come out that you can react to this and duck it every single time. They even, if you listen right here, gave him a little grunt audio cue that if you listen for, makes it very easy to duck this on reaction, and so there's never a reason to duck unless you see this throw, and so the stance doesn't work for mix-ups. Well, it turns out that there is a mix-up hidden inside the stance, but you have to do a little bit of detective work to find it, because I was thinking about this other move that he has, this Power Crush homing move, and how people have commented on how this move is like weirdly fast. It sort of explodes out of Negan in an animation that almost looks unnaturally fast. And so I went into practice mode and decided to try and step out of the stance when Negan has advantage. And it turns out that every single time Negan is going to catch the step with this move because of how fast it is. It is fast enough that it catches the startup of the side step, and so you can't step guard it. And so why might you want to step this stance? Well, it turns out that really, in my opinion, your most powerful mid in this stance, or my sort of favorite move that the stance connects to, is Intimidation 2. And it's a little bit difficult to do, but it turns out that you can actually step this quite readily to Negan's left. If you look right there, let's try and do it again. So you can see that that's actually a very steppable mid. So that's something that might incentivize you to step, allowing him to catch you with the homing move. However, how is that a mix-up? You can stand block both options, right? And so you're never going to eat any damage if you just keep on stand blocking. Well, it turns out that the Intimidation 2, this move, has massive plus frames on block. It gives Negan, I think it's +7 on block, so it's not something that you want to block. And that's why in my sort of definition of a mix-up, I talked about being susceptible to something and not necessarily eating damage. Being at -7 of disadvantage is a very dangerous position to be in, and so you don't want to block that move. The only way to escape it is to step to the side, but if you do, there is a move specifically constructed to catch that. And so this is a weird example of when a high and a homing move can actually be part of an effective mix-up. And what Negan is going to get if he connects with his mid is not necessarily damage, but an opportunity to apply another mix-up. So his reward for mixing you up, if he guesses right, is another mix-up on top of that, which is why the rabbit hole can go quite deep. But I just thought that was an interesting example of how mix-ups can be sort of counterintuitive, but once you really look at the frame data of your character and consider all the properties, once you lab something in practice mode and try and see how different moves complement one another, you can find mix-ups where you thought maybe they didn't exist. So in my last example, we talked about how a mix-up doesn't necessarily have to be created from lows and mids. It can even have highs in there, provided that the moves have properties that complement one another in some way. And another example where they've gotten really creative with this is Goliath stance from Gigas. When Gigas transitions into this stance, he will usually put the opponent at a massive amount of block stun, and then he'll walk forwards, mixing up two different moves. One of them is this very powerful mid right here, which you obviously want to stand block if you're going to defend against it, but the other option is a high. And so the way they've made that work is that they've made the high unblockable, and so if you stand block this, you're going to eat it every time. And so again, the only way to deal with this is to duck, unless you're playing Jin, because Jin has this sort of invincible and extremely powerful parry that you can parry these moves with, and then you're even going to get a launch for the punish. And so the reason I wanted to bring up this example is that the unblockable move that Gigas has here has been constructed to be extremely difficult to reverse and parry for the vast amount of characters in the cast. For example, you can't really do it with Kazumi's reversal, you can't parry with Leo, and so on. Jin's sort of parry has been intentionally designed to be extremely good at parrying almost anything. It's basically invincible, and it's sort of a core characteristic of this character. And so what I want to illustrate with this example is that whether or not something is a mix-up can actually depend on the matchup that you're playing in, because some characters will have very character-specific ways of slinking out of a mix-up that others don't have access to, and so that will demand of you that you have some serious character knowledge. It's also really bad for Gigas because it just means that his core mechanic that Namco have been pushing over and over and attempted to make stronger with this character is basically nullified by one of the strongest characters in the game, Jin. Now Gigas has some other options, he can get creative here with his belly flop and so on, but the core mix-up is completely nullified by Jin, and I thought that was an interesting example to illustrate. So at the beginning of the video, I talked about how I think we can use an understanding of mix-ups to explain why some characters in the game are better than others. But before we go into that, I want to do a little bit of a thought experiment to illustrate just how powerful mix-ups can be. So consider someone who is very new to this game, maybe picked it up recently, but at least has a functional understanding of how to apply mix-ups with their character. And this player is playing in a really high stakes match against one of the best players in the world, a super high level pro. Now that is a situation where this new player is really going to struggle for opportunities to deal damage, especially in a game where all the best players are characterized by their really good defense, right? Well, if you can get into a situation where you are applying a true 50-50, and I should probably talk a little bit about that term, I think it's a little bit problematic, because when you say 50-50, it implies that there are only two options, which usually isn't the case, and it also implies that one option is as likely to come out as the other, which usually isn't the case. But what we mean when we talk about that is that the opponent is actually forced to guess when they're defending. They don't have a way of slinking or sneaking out of the situation, kind of like how Jin did with his parry against Gigas. And so if you can get into a situation like that, no matter who you're playing against, if you're able to guess right, then you have a golden opportunity for really giant damage. If you're able to get a launcher, maybe carry that to the wall, you're going to have another opportunity for a mix-up when you apply your Oki. And if you guess right again, you might actually just take the round. So in a game where you're constantly doing your little movements and your little setups, and you're trying to create opportunities for damage, an opening like a true mix-up is a huge asset to your character. And so let's consider the case of Dragunov for a bit here, a character who is considered to be very strong by most players. I thought a lot about what seems to characterize like the strongest characters in the game. What commonalities are there between the characters who are really good in this game? And one thing that they all share is that they have very powerful safe mids that are not only safe but fast enough that they can be part of an effective mix-up when you have advantage. And so in the case of Dragunov, I think the most powerful move in that category that he has is his up forward 4. This looks pretty unassuming, but honestly is like world-endingly powerful. It really pushes the limit for how much guaranteed damage you can get off of a safe mid, in my opinion. I mean, it's scratching at the butt crack of full combo damage at 41. And it's completely safe and even has built-in low crush property. So this move is like unimaginably fantastic and is a candidate for one of the best mids in the game. And there are a lot of other moves in its category. I think, for example, up forward 4 from Devil Jin is something that is very similar in a lot of ways and serves a similar function. And so in the case of Dragunov, you're not only talking about a character who has access to plus frames with his running 2 and his back 1 plus 2, to mention a couple, but when he is at advantage and he wants to apply his mix-up, has such a powerful mid here that he's exposing himself to very little risk while creating an opportunity for really big damage. And all you need then to make that work is a low that is annoying enough that your opponent is sometimes going to be incentivized to duck, and you have a very powerful sort of engine and core strategy for your character that is going to work at any level of competition. And now you sort of have to get better and better at applying that and sort of creating opportunities for that mix-up to come to bear. And so finally, I want to consider the case of what I consider to be the two most powerful characters in this game, Jin and Devil Jin. I think those two are probably the most powerful characters in the game, and you can have opinions about that, but I think anybody would put them pretty close to the top, and these characters are characterized by their ability to apply, completely insane mix-ups, the low in their case being their very powerful iteration of the Hell Sweep. And the Hell Sweep is not only very powerful and unseeable, it also comes out of a crouch dash, meaning that it can be applied from a pretty far out range, like from out here, and still remain unseeable, which means that you can stand across from them and look at them and still feel like you are being mixed up and still worry about whether or not you have to duck, even though they haven't really put you, at disadvantage yet, which is really crazy. And I think it speaks to the power of mix-ups in Tekken, that the best characters in the game can, in theory, mix you up, even if the player controlling them has put their controller on the floor and gone to have a snack or gone to the toilet. If you don't know that they're not sitting there looking at you, you're still going to be worrying about whether or not you should duck and whether or not the next move is going to be a mid or a low. And I think that is, a pretty good illustration of just how potent mix-ups can be. And so exploring the opportunities for creating them by looking at your character's move list, looking at your character's frame data, and discovering the synergies between how different moves work, I think is a very good way of sort of creating effective strategies with your character. That's going to wrap up my little discussion for today, and I hope it was interesting enough. I've been wanting to do a video that gets into the nitty-gritty of mix-ups for a long time, because it is a common question, and it also is a pretty sort of deep and interesting topic to talk about. Hopefully you enjoyed it. As always, I have a lot of stuff on the way. I just need more time to make it. But for now, thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you guys again very soon.